Larry, I think you can start.
Okay. Well, I want to welcome everyone to today's CEPR seminar. We're pleased to have a paper by Pilar Nogues-Marco at the University of Geneva. And the title of the paper she's been working on for many years is Trade Imbalances or Silver Arbitrage, Anglo-Asian Bullion Flows in the Early Modern Period, 1664 to 1813. We'll have Pilar's presentation. And if you have questions in the course of her presentation, please use the Q&A and write them in. I will collect those questions, and at the end of Pilar's presentation, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session as the seminar usually provides. So here's Pilar.
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, to the MacroHist seminar for the invitation, and everybody for attending the seminar, and Larry for sharing it. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, you can see it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Okay, this paper, as Larry said, is indeed a research I started a long time ago. So it's a pleasure for me to present the main results that I already have. Despite it's not yet a total finished paper. The title is Trade Imbalances or Silver Arbitrage, Anglo-Asian Bullion Flows in the Early Modern Period from 1664 to 1811. So basically the origin of this research, or the main idea I had when I started this idea, is to try to understand what is the role of silver in the intercontinental trade that we observe in the early modern period. Basically, because we know very well, because there are many studies on the importance of these silver flows during the early modern period. Basically, we know that silver was the most important commodity that connected trade. And this happens because the vast majority of silver was produced in the Americas. The estimation is that around 80% of total silver was produced in the Americas, and there is a systematic flow of silver from the Americas to Asia. And in this channel of silver, we know that Europe was the most important transshipment region in this global trade, and Cape Route became the most important route by the mid-17th century. So we have a lot of information about the quantities of these precious metals, and there is a large literature on that. But however, despite we have very important information about the what we don't know very well is why we are going to observe this systematic flow of silver during 3 centuries, moving from the Americas to Asia. And here, when we think about the why, we have basically 2 different interpretations. The 2 main interpretations that are indeed they have created indeed an important debate in the interpretation of these flows of silver. So first of all, we have the Eurocentric narrative. And this is a narrative that has been built mainly by scholars working with the European companies trading with Asia. And according to these scholars, the role of silver in this global trade is basically the use of silver as money, because the European trading companies needed to have some commodity to pay for the large and persistent trade deficits with Asia. And according to this approach, indeed, the Europeans were incapable to find other commodities to exchange with Asia, and silver was the most accepted commodity for the Asian people in order to exchange for their commodities. So according to this approach, basically the main driver for this global trade is going to be the European demand for Asian commodities. So basically the idea is that these European trade companies are going to decide to start and continue this process of intercontinental trade, basically because they were capable to have very large profits coming from the commodities that they imported from Asia to Europe. So in that sense, silver is going to have a more passive role in this trade, and is going to be used only to pay for the commodities that are imported from Asia. As you know well, tea, pepper, raw silk, indigo, Indian cottons, and so on. So it's interesting, I think, and I would like to emphasize that we have good information, or at least some information about the profits of these commodities imported from Asia to Europe. There are some estimations about these markups, but however, we don't have any measurement of the profits or the markups for the commodities that were traded from Europe to Asia. And here I'm including also the case of silver as the most important commodity traded from Europe to Asia. So this is the first approach, the Eurocentric narrative, with this idea of the European demand as the main driver for this intercontinental trade. And we have also other interpretation in historiography, and it's an interpretation that has been built mainly by scholars who focus on the global history of silver. And indeed, these scholars who are mainly scholars from the California School, they consider that this Eurocentric narrative is indeed biased. And according to them, indeed, the problem is that the center of this global trade should be placed in China instead of in Europe. And the reason for that is because indeed for them the main driver of this global trade is going to come from the Chinese demand for silver. So for these scholars, silver is going to be the most important commodity in this global trade, and they emphasize that indeed the reason of these silver flows is going to be mainly the arbitrage profits that this silver is creating. Because it's going to be much more cheaper in the Americas, because it's the production center, and it's going to be much more expensive in China because of this high demand for silver to be used as money. So it's important, I think, to emphasize that this change of the center in this story is indeed reversing causality. Because for these scholars, as silver is the most important commodity, and the reason for this trade is going to be driven by the profits coming from silver. So they consider that indeed the other commodities that are going to be moved from China to Europe, and here I'm including also gold. These commodities are going to be indeed traded as the counterpart for the silver imports to China. So for these scholars who are mainly focusing on silver as the most important commodity for this trade, for these scholars we have indeed two different cycles of silver. We have the first one, the Potosi Japan cycle, which is going to, we can date it from the mid-16th century to the mid-17th century. And according to these scholars, this first cycle is going to start because China started accepting silver as a species for taxation, and this is going to be the origin of this large demand for silver in China. Here in this moment, in the moment when we start a global trade after the discovery of the Americas, we observe huge differences in the bimetallic ratio between Europe and China. So the estimation is that at the end of the 16th century, Canton had a bimetallic ratio of 1.7, and Spain was around 1.14. So silver was had we can say double price in terms of gold in Canton regarding Spain. So then for these scholars, huge amounts of silver were traded from the Americas to Europe and from Europe to Asia. And because of that, we are going to observe a process of integration at the beginning of the 18th century. But here again, we are going to start a new cycle, which is known as the Mexican cycle of silver. In this case, the trigger is going to be a growth in Chinese population. So this is going to increase demand for silver again. And here we observe a difference in the bimetallic ratio, which is not so large as before, but still the estimation is that in China, the bimetallic ratio was around 110. And in Europe, however, it was around 115. So because there are these differences in the bimetallic ratio, again, we are going to observe this process of arbitrage. And because of that, there is a new integration by mid 18th century. So this is the way in which these scholars are explaining the cycles of silver. And here, what I found interesting in this story is that indeed what we observe is that there is a very large narrative on this idea of silver arbitrage. But however, we don't have any study that is intended to quantify what is the arbitrage gains of this silver flows. So contrary to what is happening with the commodities imported from Asia to Europe, for which we have several estimations on the profitability, we don't have any study here for precious metals trying to quantify what is the profitability of this process of trade between Europe and Asia. And here I would like to emphasize that indeed one of the main reasons I think that could explain why is this happening, why we don't observe any empirical study trying to measure these arbitrage gains for silver, is related, in my view, to the way in which scholars on early modern period deal with this idea of arbitrage, which is very much related to the concept of the bimetallic ratio, as I have shown you. And here, basically, when we think in terms of the bimetallic ratio, this is a relative price. So basically, we are comparing the quantities of silver in relation to the quantities of gold. And this is very much problematic for me, basically because this is hidden what is the real price of silver, or what is the price of gold in absolute terms. And also because if we focus on the bimetallic ratio, we are imposing by definition that we are going to have always flows of silver against gold and vice versa. So we don't accept the possibility of having flows of both gold and silver going in the same direction. So what I'm trying to do here is to try to analyze the profitability of silver arbitrage, but instead of focusing on the idea that we have in the historiography about the bimetallic ratio, what I did is to go to the primary sources, and I'm working with the archive of the East India Company and trying to see how exactly the contemporaries did deal with this business. So what I'm trying to do is to reproduce gains on silver in the same way as the contemporaries did during the early modern period. So for that, we have to recognize two things that we cannot observe explicitly if we consider the bimetallic ratio. One is that prices for both gold and silver are defined in the unit of account. So there is no any case of a silver price in terms of gold or gold price in terms of silver. And both gold and silver were priced in the unit of account. That's important. And it's also important to highlight the concept of the exchange rate in this period. And basically, the idea here is that it's not so clear indeed to understand the way in which the exchange rates were defined at that time. Basically, because we are in a context in which the bills of exchange market has not been totally developed yet. So it's not so easy as if we think in Europe, where you have the bills of exchange market and the quotations of the exchange rate. Here we need to understand how the contemporaries define the exchange rate. But I would like to emphasize that there was an exchange rate. So this is a concept that what was used by the contemporaries in this process of global trade. So basically, my point here was to go to look for these prices and exchange rate in order to try to measure this profitability of arbitrage for these flows of silver moving from Europe to Asia. In order to do that, what I did is to collect all these prices using the archives of the East India Company. The period I have is the 1664, which is the beginning of the accounting of the East India Company. And then the final point is 1811, because from that point, it's very complicated to get this information from the accounting, because it's too much aggregated and I cannot get the unitary prices anymore. But in this period from mid 17th century to the beginning of the 19th century, I have a very good data for prices of both gold and silver in London and in the different centers in Asia. So I have Mocha, Bombay, Surat, Madras, Bengal, Southeast Asia, and China. So I decided to disaggregate all the information. So instead of thinking in Europe versus Asia, I thought it was important to distinguish the different centers within Asia, basically because each center I'm considering is using a different monetary system. So by considering a center as a separate unit, I'm capable to understand what is the monetary systems and therefore what is the exchange rate behind these transactions. So this was my main idea. And at the same time, I think that this is useful also because this is going to permit us to distinguish what is the final destination for these silver flows within Asia. Basically because the California School has this idea that China was the final market for this silver, but there are other scholars, for instance, I have quoted here Parasarati, who consider that indeed in this sinocentric approach, the role of India as a central place for this silver has been misinterpreted. And these scholars consider that India indeed had a very important role also in this trade, and it was not only China. So I'm going to be capable to have the different destinations for these silver flows because I have collected the data center by center. So my approach indeed is quite simple. So basically, I'm talking about the standard idea of the specie point mechanism, which is very familiar for scholars working on arbitrage gains for the 19th century. And also in the early modern period, but talking about Europe, so transactions within Europe. But as I said, is not so familiar for scholars thinking in global trade, as they usually focus more on this idea of the bimetallic ratio. So my starting point is the specie point mechanism, but here I'm considering transaction cost as 0, basically because the East India Company didn't charge transport cost to gold and silver. So I'm focusing directly on the law of one price. So what I'm computing is the difference of prices for gold and silver in the two centers. So in London versus its center in destination, and multiply by the exchange rate. So basically, if the prices of in London are higher, we are going to observe these movements of metal from Asia to London, and on contrary, if the prices in Asia are higher, we are going to observe this trade of silver from London to Asia. So it's the basic idea of the law of one price. In order to do that, I have used the different accounting books, so mainly the journals and the ledgers, and I'm going to show you now very quickly a couple of pictures to give you an idea about how these prices and exchange rate were computed in the accounting. And then I am still trying to complete all this story with some qualitative information, which is very useful for me in order to get extra information to define the monetary systems in Asia and the exchange rates, and maybe how we can compute the intrinsic pair between the London currency and the Asian currencies. So we have several accounts for gold and silver because it was computed as, for instance, gold as a specie, ingots, ducats, silver can appear as pieces of 8, ingots, silver, and so on. But the advantage is that in the accounting, all the different forms of silver or gold are always standardized to the British fineness. So this is very useful because indeed I'm computing a total homogeneous silver. So it's the same, is the silver with the same standard in origin and in destination. So here we have an example of the accounting. So this is the quantities and prices at which the silver was bought in London. So it's a very systematic registry. So we have always the standard ounces of silver. We have also some information about the ingots, but the most important is that the quantities, the physical quantities, are standardized. Then we have sometimes the unitary prices, sometimes not, but never mind, because we have always what is the value of the transaction, and because we have the quantities and the value, we can always calculate the unitary price. This is the price in origin, and here we have the price in destination. And here what we have is that the prices are also computed in sterling pounds. And what we need to do is to go to the original journals to see how this was computed in the local currencies. So that's quite easy because the accounting is going to tell us where is this transaction in the journal. So here we have an example, and this is one example for silver, for the case of silver. And here we can see how they report what is the exchange rate. and all the detail about this transaction to give you an idea. So we have here several types of silver. These are the pieces of 8, the quarters pieces of 8, cruzados, dollars. So we have all the detail in the journals about these transactions, and we have the prices also in the local currencies according to the exchange rates used by the East India Company. So what I did is to collect all this information. I collected each transaction, and then I have computed the yearly unitary prices, and I have also the quantities. Despite the quantities is not my main interest here, but I need the quantities in order to get the unitary prices. So here I'm going to start showing you how we can see what is happening with silver, and then I'm going to show you what is happening with gold. So here basically what we have is the East India Company purchases, so which is this yellow bars. And this is the quantities bought in London by the East India Company. And then we have the East India Company sales. So these are the quantities sold in destination by the East India Company. So we can already see that destination India is going to be a main place in destination together with China. The Southeast Asia is going to be also important, mainly in the 17th century. Then step by step is going to be less important because China and mainly trade with tea is going to become much more important. So we have also a period in which we observe a reduction in the quantities of silver, and this is mainly related to the role of the East India Company as a territorial power in India. So here what is happening is that when the East India Company started the political expansion, they started to use also debt instead of sending silver to India. So that means that the political expansion of the East India Company is going to have an impact in these flows of silver. At some point, debt was too large, so the company was forced by parliament because there was a ceiling on debt. So the company was forced to continue sending silver because it was not possible to increase debt anymore. But this is basically the reason why we are going to observe a reduction of these quantities of silver. And then here we have, here we have the prices, which was my main interest in this research. And here what we observe indeed is that the differences in prices are not very large. So at the beginning, I was surprised with this result because I expected to get something more in line to the idea of the California school, and I expected to have a large profits on silver. But then I understood that indeed this is happening because of the way in which the East India Company is defining the concept of the exchange rate, which is indeed something that make a lot of sense, because basically what the East India Company did, and this is what I'm going to show you now, is to define the exchange rate according to the relative market prices of the currencies. So that means that by definition, we cannot get gains on this arbitrage, because we are defining exchange rate at the relative market prices for the currencies. And this is the reason why we don't observe large gains in arbitrage. So basically, this is the case of China. China is quite easy indeed, because the Chinese tail was indeed an ingot that circulated by weight. So that means that if we compute the intrinsic par, which is what I did here with the green line, we observe that the market prices, yes, the market price is the relative price of silver in origin and destination is going to fluctuate according to the intrinsic par. So what I'm doing now is to start collecting the quotations of bills of exchange at the beginning of the 19th century, when we start having these regular quotations for the exchange rates, just to be sure that everything makes sense, so that the East India Company is not doing weird things, saying in a simple way. And basically, when the market emerges, we are going to observe that the prices are in line with those I found for the previous period with the data from the East India Company. So then, as I said, we are going to observe that there are not large gains on trade with silver, basically because the law of one price holds by definition. And as I said, this is because the exchange rate is going to be defined according to the relative market prices of silver in London and in China. Then India is a little bit more complicated. India indeed is been very challenging for me. Here we have Surat and Bombay. And what we observe is that in the case of India, there are large differences between the intrinsic par, so the relative quantity of physical silver in both currencies, in the shilling and in the Bombay rupee. So there is a large difference between the intrinsic par and the market value. So the market value are the dot, and these are the prices I have collected. And what was interesting for me is to see that when we plot the exchange rate defined by the East India Company, we see that indeed the exchange rates and the devaluations and revaluations are following market prices. So here again, I would like to emphasize this idea that the law of one price holds by definition, because the East India Company is defining the exchange rate according to the relative market prices of silver. Something similar for Madras and Bengal. Madras indeed defined the exchange rate in gold instead of in silver. So that's why we observe that there is a revaluation when in the other cases there is a devaluation. But the idea, the logic is the same logic. We are going to have these exchange rates defined by the East India Company, which are going to fit to the market prices in India. And here again, in the cases of Madras and Bengal, I would like to highlight this idea that there are large differences between the intrinsic par and the market value. So in the case of Bengal, is very large, is in some periods higher than 40%. And the East India Company exchange rate is following the market prices. It's not following the intrinsic par, is following the market prices in the same way as happened in Europe in the 19th century. And because for Europe, we have more studies, and there is this idea of the concept of the arbitrated par. And basically the arbitrated par is just the relative market prices of precious metals. So here is exactly the same idea. Is what I have found is the same logic. And the only difference is that because we don't have an exchange rate given directly by the bills of exchange market, we need to understand how this exchange rate is defined by the company. But for the rest is the same idea that we know for the 19th century for the SPC point mechanism. So once I had silver, I said, okay, so then if the East India Company is defining the exchange rates in silver, So I'm going to observe these differences in the prices of gold and silver when we look at gold instead of silver. And it is right. And when we look at gold, we find this Mexican cycle of silver. And that's interesting because the scholars who have working on this previously on the quantities, because as I said, we don't have studies on prices, but we have many studies on quantities. But these scholars basically focus on the idea of the flows of gold and silver moving from Europe to Asia. And they didn't compute the quantities of precious metals coming from Asia to Europe. Basically, I think because it was not the interest of these scholars. So here I have computed flows of gold going in both directions in the same way I did with silver. And here what we have again is that in the 17th century, we have large quantities of gold, both in London and sold in Asia, mainly in India, and more specifically, mainly in Madras, because Madras is the region of India which is much more gold oriented. And then we have this period, which I have highlighted with this red circle, and this is the Mexican cycle of silver. So in this period is right that we are going to observe this gold that was bought in China and it was sold in London. I was surprised that indeed the quantities were not very large. So what I'm trying to do is to understand why the East India Company didn't take advantage of this business in order to buy higher quantities of gold. And basically the information I'm finding in the correspondence is that indeed it was not so easy to buy gold if we compare, for instance, with tea. It was much more complicated to engage the Chinese merchants to deliver gold. So it was much more risky, and sometimes what we see is that the company, not only the English company, also the French company, had estimated quantities of gold that they could buy, and when they arrived to China, the gold was not available, and it was, of course, a complication for these companies who didn't know if coming back with the silver, if sending the silver to lend money there, and so on. So I think that this kind of barriers reduce the opportunities of getting this commodity, and this is the reason why we are going to observe that the process is going to take long in time. And here we see better with the prices, which is the reason for which we are going to have these quantities of gold moving from China to London. And here I think that we see very well this idea that has been emphasized by the California school, mainly by Finn and Giraldez, which is this idea. Here I have prices of gold in London and in India. So it was quite similar, and this is something that is well known by the historiography, that indeed India and London had similar prices in both gold and silver, so a similar bimetallic ratio. And however, when we look at China, we have these prices of gold, which was much more lower. So when the company started to trade with China, the price was lower than 55 shilling, already transformed to the British units. And then step by step, because of this process of arbitrage, we are going to see how the prices of gold in China are going to increase. And at some point in the mid-18th century, we are going to see how the prices have already equalized between London and China. So it's not profitable anymore to continue this business. We have Southeast Asia with prices in between China and India, which I find also interesting as an indicator of the disintegration of these markets in the Asian region. And then I have also one data for MOCA, but it's only one, so I'm not sure how representative it is. But basically, this is the story of the arbitrage gains. So finally, the last thing I have done was to see how important was this for the whole story. And for that, what I have done is to try to compare this profitability that we get with gold in comparison with tea and raw silk, also bought in China, to compare profitability of different commodities that were bought in China and sold in London. And here the result is a little bit mixed, I think, because on the one hand, it's right that gold profits were important. They were something similar in level to raw silk, but however, we have to say that they were much more lower than the case of tea, for instance. And of course, this is the reason why tea is going to be the most important commodity, which is going to be traded by the East India Company step by step, and is going to gain a huge share in the total imports of the company. So finally, to sum up what I have at the moment, is that with this estimation I have done on the gains for these arbitrages, what I find is that, or the way in which I interpret these numbers, is that it is, in my view, exaggerated to say that silver gains are going to be the most important reason of this intercontinental trade. What we observe is that indeed silver is not going to offer any profitability or any important profitability to the East India Company, basically because the exchange rate is going to be defined in silver as the relative market prices of silver. But we observe that there is a profit for gold. So part of the story is right, but it's a little bit exaggerated to say that this is going to be the main reason. So my results in comparison about how important are these gains are mixed. So gold was so important as raw silk. So I'm not saying that it's not important. What I'm saying is that it's not the most important reason, because if we compare, for instance, with tea, we see that tea was much more profitable. I also would like to highlight the role of India as the end market for these precious metals. So in that sense, I also think that this Sinocentric approach, which is focusing very much on China, can be exaggerated, because what we observe is that India is going to be a very important center for these precious metals, basically because in this trade there was a large amount of commodities that came from India. And finally, I would like to highlight also that despite these gains on precious metals are not going to be, in my view, the main reason, I think that this approach, this Sinocentric approach, is important for us. And I would like to highlight that for me, it makes a lot of sense to say that it's not possible to interpret this intercontinental trade focusing only on the European side of this story. We have to take into account also the Asian side of this story. And a nice way to do that is to consider also gold and silver as silver mainly was the most important commodity traded from Europe to Asia. And this has been my interest in this paper, to try to highlight also the role of Asia in this trade, and mainly focusing on silver as the most important commodity for this trade. So that's all. Thank you very much, and I'm waiting for your questions.
Thank you, Pilar. We have some questions that have shown up in the queue, so I will read those, I guess, sort of in the order they came in. A basic philosophical question, of course, probably from one of your first diagrams, is from Francois Velde. And he poses that if Alice and Bob exchange bananas for apples, is the cause Alice's demand for apples or Bob's demand for bananas? And I don't know if you want to take that on, but let me also mention the other questions, which really focus on transport costs and possibly the difference in transport costs between gold and tea. Guillaume Dodin says that comparison between the markups of gold and tea is interesting, but of course, transport costs are not the same. Could they be so large for tea that they explain part of the difference? That markup on tea was to cover transport costs, which would have to be, I assume, much greater than for gold. And Guillaume says he thinks transport costs for raw silk are smaller than for tea as well. I don't know. And then the final question, could you elaborate more on why you think transaction cost is too small to be ignored? In medieval period, transportation cost seems very important to transport silver over gold from one place to another, especially from America to Asia, such a long distance. So those are questions about the nature of arbitrage and transport costs.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in terms of transport cost, and I have the data on transport cost for tea, so I didn't include to simplify the story, but I can include them. So first of all, I have to say that transport cost is a very minor percentage of this huge markup I find. So that's important, that the vast majority of the markup is mainly driven by the mercantilist way of dealing with this. Basically, these companies, the East India Company and the Dutch company, control to have high markups, basically by reducing the quantities that they offer in the European market. So it's a kind of Cournot monopolistic approach, and this is the way in which they maintain high markups. But it's right that I can plot the transport cost to give an idea about what is the percentage of the transport cost and the percentage of the net profitability. And then for gold and silver, there are two things here. One is that for the East India Company, until the Napoleonic Wars, in the period of the Napoleonic Wars, this is going to complicate because of the risk of war. But until the end of the 18th century, non-commodity going from Asia to Europe is going to be charged with the transport cost. So basically, the company charge all the I'm not sure if I said the other way around, but the company is going to charge the whole amount of transport cost for the imports, and none of the export is going to pay a transport cost. And in the case of gold and silver, it's very special, because when gold is moving from Asia to Europe, is not going to pay any transport cost, basically because the chests were controlled directly by the captain, and the volume of gold and silver in relation to value is very small. So I think that this is the reason why it's considered in this shipping, intercontinental shipping scheme. Gold and silver are considered very special commodities. So they are not, when the company calculate the tonnage to calculate transport cost, insurance, and so on, gold and silver is not included that, basically because it's going to be directly supervised by the captain. But anyway, I could compute if needed some estimation of transport cost but the story for me, what I would like to highlight is that this is a story of differences in prices. This is not driven by transport cost. It's driven by differences in prices. But I can add some estimation of transport cost if needed. That's not problematic. And then the question of the bananas and the apples. Yes. Well, the point for this, or how I understand this literature, is that there is a link between the demand and the profitability that the companies get from this demand. So basically, when we think in terms of the tea, cottons, and so on, the idea is that we are going to have a high demand for these commodities in Europe. This is going to be controlled by the companies in order to maintain high demand, and this is the reason why you are going to get high profits. And in the same way, and I think that this is probably what Francois is trying to say, we have the demand for silver in China, and this is what the Finance Heraldet wants to emphasize. And this is why I expected to have a higher profits in silver. But this is not the case because, as I said, the way in which the exchange rate was defined was according to the relative prices of silver between Asia and Europe. So for sure there is a demand for silver in Asia, that's for sure. And this is the reason why it was the most important commodity. But this is not going to generate profits for the companies because of the way in which they are defining the exchange rates.
Okay, I think, this question of transport costs, we have to remember that the age of sale, you're not really talking about the price of coal and the like. And so there's actually, it seems to be currently a move back towards trying to use sail more in ocean shipping, precisely because it does reduce transport costs. Peter Sola, though, had a question about other costs of arbitrage, such as the length of the voyage time out and back, which would take a couple of years, and there's an uncertainty over the time what would happen between the market that you have information on, and by the time the poor merchant gets there, things could have changed quite dramatically. I find in the literature that a lot of the directions that are given to supercargoes are, oh, for Christ, crying out loud, use your own judgment when you get there, because the information we have right now in the market may be just irrelevant for what you see. So there's a lot of individual choice, decision making that goes on, it seems to me. I think those are all the questions that have come up. I did pose a question to you earlier directly about taking into account the period of the paper pound during the Napoleonic period. And I also am thinking some of the work by the American scholars in this period indicate that, and this seems to be true for the bearings, finding that the costs of American ships going to China and India during this period, the Napoleonic period, are much lower, and the Americans are actually far more competitive than the East India Company ships in terms of transport costs, and consequently are very competitive. Actually, I think the Barings really wanted to get more activity from the American side that they could finance, which is one of the reasons eventually the whole monopoly of the East India Company gets dismissed after the Napoleonic Wars. So I think you have a fascinating topic here. You've obviously spent an awful lot of time on it, collected an amazing amount of data. I think I'll have to thank you because we've basically run out of the allotted time. And what I wanted to do is to announce, I think, the next seminar, which I had here. Here we go. Yes, it'll be on the 19th of April. And the title is Persistent Specialization and Growth, the Italian Land Reform. And it's co-authored by Riccardo Bianchi Vinicati from Northwestern, Gianpaolo Lecce from the University of Groningen, and Matteo Magna-Riccardi from Northwestern. It'll be chaired by Carol Hsu from the University of Colorado at Boulder. So thank you all for participating. If you want to participate in a further Q&A session at the end of this, we can do that, I think. But Rui?
Yeah, I don't have a question myself, but I think there's new questions on the queue, Larry. There's
yeah.
Did you ask Shevkat's question?
Okay, Shevkat's question. He asks, yeah, I can read that off. Did you come across any evidence that any of the governments in Asia tried to attract silver or gold by trying to apply an exchange rate different than that of the market rate, in effect, an attempt to manipulate the direction of arbitrage? Or were they basically passive and it became a market-driven process, at least as far as the East India Company was concerned?
Yeah, well, this is very different if we think in China or in India, and also different if we think in the Southeast Asia, because in Southeast Asia, the currency indeed was the Spanish, was the foreign currency, the Spanish piece of 8. In China, the system was very simple because this tail, Cupin tail, circulated by weight. So it's a pure market market price. The case of India is much more complicated indeed, because you have these local lenders and these money changers, lenders and money changers. So basically, they were the intermediaries between the people and the means, and they charge large seigniorage cost. So this is not going to imply, in my view, a manipulation in terms of the exchange rate, but this is going to affect the market rate. Basically, because what I have understanding is that the legal price for currencies in India circulated by tail and not by weight. And this is the reason why we find these huge differences between the intrinsic part and the market prices. So it's not a manipulation of the exchange rate, I think, but it's given a very large difference between market prices and the intrinsic part. And then there is before other question by Peter Solar, I think, again about the cost of arbitrage. and he's asking about the concept of cost in a large way, so time, cost, and several risks. So for time cost, I have some ideas, basically because with the correspondence, we have the date of, the date when the letters were written and the time when the letters were received. And it's right that there are periods with very large delays. So for all the commodities, because this is happening for gold, silver, tea, and everything. So it could be possible to compute in some way, the opportunity cost of the capital that you are investing in this business in comparison with other kind of activity. And there are also, of course, risk of losing ships, and there are some cases when they lost. There is a case I remember when they lost a coffer of silver. So basically, what the company did is to reduce the profits for several years in order to balance this loss. But it's right that part of the business is related to this. But this is something that is not special for silver; is for all the different commodities in this trade. And regarding your question, Larry, about also, because it's right that the East India Company freights were much more expensive because once the mercantilism ended, so we can see how these freights reduce, basically because the East India Company had the right to decide who construct the ship for the company. And because of that, the freight is not a competitive transport cost, but still is very small in relation to the total markup. And in the case of the East India Company, what happened during the Napoleonic Wars is that indeed the freights increase, and they distinguish between, and they say very explicit, war freight, peace freight. So they are computing an extra freight in order to try to capture this risk of the war, which is something.
Guillaume Dodin has been unmuted.
Yes, thank you.
To ask another question. So Guillaume, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very interesting paper, but I must admit that I'm a bit flabbergasted by how you're thinking about causality, and how the literature is thinking about causality. And it reminded me of a paper by O'Rourke and Williamson in the GEH 2002, when they tried to attribute the rise of the trade between Europe and Asia to European demand, Asian supply, transport costs after Columbus, explaining Europe's overseas trade boom. And I was wondering, and here the idea of causality is a bit clever, right? Because they're looking at the movement of the curves in a supply and demand diagram, and so they attribute the change in the quantities to these movements. And I was wondering if something similar could be done for species. Maybe that will clarify causality.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and indeed there is a paper written by Flynn and Giraldet, which is a kind of trying to reply to O'Rourke and Williamson. And because basically the main critique of Flynn and Giraldet in this paper is that in the whole narrative of the Europeans, and here we can include O'Rourke and Williamson, they consider only the commodities traded from Asia to Europe. And he said, okay, if you include silver in your story, maybe the picture is different. And then the answer, because there is an answer in the European Review of Economic History given by O'Rourke and Williamson, they say we don't deal with silver and the treasure. And then they, I don't remember if there is other replay or not by Flynn and Giraldet, but basically the critique is that in the whole story, the Europeans are considering only the commodities traded from Asia to Europe. And this is the reason, the main motivation why I decided to start this paper, to try to see what is happening if we look at the other side of the story.
Okay. Francois Velda's in the queue and has a follow-up question. Go ahead. Francois?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
No, it was just a remark that it's interesting to see the big impact of the depreciation of the shilling when all the clipping goes crazy in the 1690s. So you can see it and then rebounds with the Great Recoinage of 1695. It's just a remark.
Yeah, you are totally right. The impact was huge. Indeed, was much more higher in London than the impact of the Napoleonic Wars in terms of the price of silver. Yeah, it was interesting for me because it's right that we have now data on silver and gold prices in London before the data that was collected by the course of the exchange. Yeah. Thanks.
I think Peter Solar still has his hand up. So, Peter? Peter?
Yeah, you've asked my question already. That's fine. I don't know.
Okay.
I had my hand up.
Okay, put your hand down then. Okay. Any other questions? And okay. I think we can stop now. And thank you very much, Pilar. I hope that we've encouraged you to continue your work. And obviously you have a wider audience than a lot of additional questions are coming up. You've got a wide range of possibilities here for further publications. So thank you very much, and thank all of the participants as well for their interest in as well. I hope you'll be willing to contact Pilar directly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pilar. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to leave then.
Bye.